Hello, I'm David Hunt and welcome to The Art Hunter. My guest today is of mixed race parents. That story alone is a whole show. She grew up in Logan in Queensland. She works across sculpture, installation, body adornment, also works in moving images, photography, projection work in the digital world. Her statement and use of historical colonial books and texts, transforming them into new forms of cultural beauty and pride. So beautiful what she does there. She has a Bachelor in Visual Communication Design, postgrad in Museum Studies. She's either won or a finalist in so many awards. Living in England, she worked at an Oxford museum on a queering collection. Can't wait to talk about that. Coming back to Australia, this is a part of history that she's part of. She was on the first flight back to Australia and it was cancelled because of COVID. Yay! There's a little story to tell her doggy, which she loves. Signed to Mars Gallery, curated her first show for Craft Victoria and has since been appointed on the board of Craft Victoria. She also has pieces up the road at the Victorian Pride Centre. Jenna Lee, hello and welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
My pleasure. All right, tell us a story about your parents.
Yeah, so I think, and it's a story that is really common in the north of Australia. So I'm a Larrakia traditional owner, who are the traditional owners of the Darwin region.
Okay.
Also have ancestry from the Gulumerridjin through KarraJarri. And because of that location in Australia, my dad also has mixed Asian heritage, which is a really common thing to have happened because of the pearling industry of the 1800s. And my mum is Anglo-Australian from kind of southeast around this area. So, it's moving down to Victoria, it is probably one that you don't come across so much, but in the north, I'm from one of the largest families in Darwin, and so in Darwin, Chinese, Aboriginal, Japanese, Filipino is a very common mix.
Yeah, I could imagine it would be. yeah. And after the Second World War and all that as well. What does that mean to you? How is it? Because it would have helped you so much growing up because you have an understanding a lot more than the average person.
Yeah, it's been interesting, and I moved around a lot, kind of growing up, and I think moving around was always really interesting because people tended to notice in me what was familiar with them. And so that's always been something really interesting growing up, but also kind of being mixed race and having mixed identities can be a little bit confusing as well because you're kind of not quite enough of any one thing to feel like you fit in. So even, I guess, growing up, we have customs and traditions, which I guess are different to the other kids in school, but you don't really know where they came from. You just know they're family traditions. So for example, at certain family funerals, we wear white. And so, things like that kind of growing up, you just know we did them. But I guess when you're mixed race, you don't know where the traditions come from all the time. But it was kind of something that younger I found really confusing and difficult, being queer as well, and not quite queer enough to be a part of anywhere, and having to self-identify as Aboriginal as well is kind of, just because of the way I look, can be really confusing. But I think that's where art came in and really helped me articulate that. And it's been something that people actually now really connect with in my work, especially other mixed race Aboriginal people of my generation really kind of see themselves in my work.
So when did it all start, the art? And what was it? What was the trigger?
I was working as a graphic designer, and I've become really good at articulating the difference between art and design, I think, especially the type of design I was working in. I see design as telling other people's stories, and it can be very rewarding and amazing. But I really needed an outlet to tell my own story. I would kind of walk into big boardrooms working on projects for Aboriginal audiences or with Aboriginal organisations, and having to self-identify, when they would ask, is anybody Aboriginal going to be working on this project? You kind of have to put your hand up and say, oh, actually, that's me. Younger, that was a really confronting thing to do. So I needed an outlet to be able to work through that, to explore what I was feeling. And I made a few pieces around those kind of ideas of not really fitting in. And what's really nice about that is I don't work that way anymore, because I think those artworks help me process it and become really confident in what I'm doing now.
Okay. All right, well, let's start talking about, I love it, the textbooks, the colonial textbooks. Tell the story, because this is the thing that just blows me away.
Yeah, and it's funny to have gotten to this point, because so many things in I am still a graphic designer, and what I design are books, and I've always been a typesetter and a layout designer, so that...
And here you are ripping them up.
Exactly, and it kind of got to this point where I have a friend who says, I just can't imagine anybody else doing this, and I can't imagine you doing anything else. And kind of got to that point where it was very accidental.
So where did it come from? Do you remember it?
Yeah,
Okay.
I was working at the Queensland Museum, and one of my colleagues and very good friends and I walked across to the Lifeline book fair that happens. I'm not sure if it happens in Victoria, but it's a big book fair of secondhand books, and we were walking through, and she picked up this book, and it was just horrible, racist book written from kind of this very colonial gaze about, you know, a tribe around Darwin. And reading that, you're like, that's my people, that's who you're writing about. And she said, you should turn this into art. And I kind of laughed because she knew that I was an artist kind of and a graphic designer. So I bought it. Turns out that book is incredibly rare, and I haven't ever used it because I want to make sure I can replace the book in my own collection. And I can't afford to, because the other copies are much more than the $30 I paid for it. And I held on to that book and didn't know what to do with it. I didn't like what was written. And around the same time, I was doing a professional development course with some other Aboriginal artists, and was kind of sharing stories around art that can be in gallery spaces that use derogatory language as a way of sharing with wider audiences. Experiences can actually be quite traumatizing for community members. And because of the way I look and the way I navigate through society, I have a level of privilege, which means that words have always been said around me, but never at me. And so I realized then that I could never repeat the words that were in these books. So I realized it was my duty to destroy them and repurpose them. And I kind of say that my work is about translation or deconstruction and reconstruction. So I'm kind of taking something that's there that's pretty awful, and from I say from a time in history, but the books I work with currently are actually still in print, and then translate them and transform them into something really beautiful and something that my community can feel safe walking into a space to view, and to see objects that will actually make them really happy. And that's kind of, if I'm not making art for my community, who am I making it for? So that was the process, and it was quite a slow process. Another kind of thing that I guess makes this the medium I should work at is my mum, who is Anglo-Australian but is also one of my primary teachers in art and craft, used to work at a paper store.
Oh, okay.
And she taught me at a really young age how to make recycled paper.
Right.
So it kind of just all fit together that this was what I needed to be doing.
So, tell our viewers, what's the process? What are you doing with these books?
Yeah, I work with them in a few ways. I pulp. The first way I started working with them is pulping them. So I rip them apart, and then I use a kitchen stick mixer and water, and then I essentially make paper pulp, which is the same process of recycled paper. And then I sculpt with that, and as it dries, it hardens. And then I also work, I say that it's weaving, but I more consider it a process of rebinding. So I make string from the paper, and then I weave it. So
hold on, let's explain that. Yep. It's ripping it quite thin, is it? And then you wrap a thread around it?
I mean, kind of. In the same way that I guess my ancestors would have worked with a fibre like pandanus, I take the book and then I cut it into strips, 1.5 centimetre strips, and then I glue them together. And I have
do you actually measure it?
Yeah, I have a guillotine set up at home with I used to measure it, and now that I'm a professional artist, I have kind of the equipment, and I have it's a good size to work with. And I glue them together, and they're cut quite long strands, and then I twist them in a process very similar to making, I guess, traditional fibre string. And then it's essentially a blanket stitch or a coil basket making, where I use a bookbinding thread to re-bind this book back together. And I have a bit of a process of not wanting to add anything new. So any of the materials that you see in my weaving works are completely bought from bookbinding, bookbinderies, and they're bookbinding. And all the tools I use are bookbinding tools.
Right. And so therefore you make a tree. There's a fantastic tree that you make. They're called trees, aren't they?
Grass trees.
Grass trees, but you do bowls and pendants and. Yeah,
I started out making dilly bags because that's kind of the object from childhood memory that I have. That my alap, which is the Larrakia word for grandmother, had given me, and an object that I had grown up around. And then one day I was just kind of looking at a dilly bag, and I thought that weave would work for a grass tree, because I'm also very interested in how nature does what I do, and it takes something and then breaks it down and then builds something new, which I guess is just, decomposition. Nature is, one of those things that I just find is so beautiful. And I was really interested in fire, I think because at the same time I was living in London and the bushfires were happening in Australia.
Yeah.
And I was just watching from afar, just our country on fire, and, had really started to think, because on Larrakia country we do backburning.
That's right.
We traditionally burn, which is something that I was kind of watching the southeast burn, and I knew what we do up north. So I wanted to look at fire, and grass trees are a tree that need fire to live, and our environment here in Australia needs the fire, and when we don't allow it to burn, it will find a way to burn.
Well, they're actually using backburning now, Aboriginal backburning, because they've totally got it. Yeah. So here they are. I'm still fascinated how you got to that point. And the fact is that some of the pieces, if you look really closely, you can read certain words as well, can't you?
Yeah, and these days I work exclusively, or have been for about 18 months, with Aboriginal language dictionaries, or just Aboriginal dictionaries, which I find really interesting because the books that I use in particular don't say where the words came from. So it's like presenting somebody with an Asian dictionary and then not saying where a word came from. It just came from Asia, which is nonsensical. There's no Aboriginal language. It's 250 languages and 850 regional dialects. So it's this kind of useless reference book, and you kind of might not be able to see it in a lot of my work, but there is an element of humour, and I just find it hilarious that there's this dictionary that is completely useless, and it's still in print.
Really?
Yeah, there's still
who
copies.
uses it? Does it schools? Does it go into?
I have no idea. The introduction text has a phrase in it which says that this book has been, published for people to find pleasant sounding Aboriginal words to name their children, houses and boats, which again is why I started working with it, because the first three things, as well as language, that were taken from us were our children, our land and our water. So to have our words kind of served up in this manner to name, I think you'll see it a lot in quite old homes. There'll be little plaques with names.
Yep.
Often they're Aboriginal words. And they've kind of just gone through this book and thought, I like that word. And actually a lot of the books I buy, which are secondhand, have words underlined or stars drawn next to them.
Okay.
So it's just really interesting to think about the life of where these words have had and where they've ended up. So that's why I work with them. And I think, the same year I started working with them, we had the International Year of Indigenous Languages, and there are so many of us here in Australia working to relearn our languages. And so I want to kind of take these books out of circulation, but with the understanding that the actual reference lists that these books use can be really helpful to kind of investigate, because this book in particular would have taken from handbooks that would have been published of specific regions. It was essentially just a money-making book though, because you can't really use it, which is, it's just very interesting.
Yeah. Now, I just want to go back to the grass trees, because they're all different heights, aren't they?
Yeah.
And they must be so time-consuming.
They are. They're probably the most time-consuming thing I do, and labour-intensive in that it's quite physical, having to work, and they end up being quite tall, about my hip height. And so sitting there trying to weave that, it's quite an awkward shape and size. It starts out really nice and I can weave with it in my lap, but then it ends up, so I have to have a bit of a break after every time I do one, just to rest my body.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are. And then, kind of creating the tops of them, the actual grass bit, is another quite time-intensive thing, because they're very thinly cut, pages that form the tops of the grass tree, and that takes a bit of time as well. But I do love it when I sit back and look at one finish, especially when they're grouped together in the same way that you'd see them, after a fire has gone through and there's nothing else except these grass trees. I do really love how they look.
And do you still do them?
I do, yeah. I'm planning an installation at the moment. I'm hoping of about 10, and I always say that and then get a few in and think, I don't know if I'm going to make it. But I've just made 3 for Sydney Contemporary, which is happening at the moment.
Right.
And just loved how they look together. I think previously I've made 1 and it's always sat on its own, and there's something really nice in seeing them standing together.
Because out in, like the outback there's not one by themselves.
No, and I mean, that's how they germinate. A fire goes through and the fire helps them germinate. So you kind of always see them in these big clusters and groups together.
Yeah.
Especially up on Larrakia country, they're kind of quite prominent in the landscape.
Let's talk about London. Why did you go?
Originally, it was always specifically to work with ancestral objects in anthropology museums, and so that's why I went back to university and did my postgrad in museum studies, because I figured the best way to get a foot in the door was to work there. That never ended up quite happening, but what I did do is send out my CV and a letter and a project description from a project I received funding from the Australia Council through the Dreaming Award for, and the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford was the only one to get back to me, which is fine because they were amazing. And it just so happened that at the same time I emailed them, they were planning an exhibition called Beyond the Binary, Queering the Collection, and was really interested in my work and my experiences kind of as a First Nations Australian queer woman. And so we kind of came up with a bit of a deal. I was given complete collections access, was able to, touch and with gloves, objects that were likely to have come from my ancestors, and I gave work to the exhibition. Right. So it was an incredibly rewarding experience, and the Pitt Rivers Museum has a particularly violent colonial history, in that not necessarily violent but just has it's kind of a museum of museums now, in that the way they display objects has never changed. Yep. So a lot of museums have done things, but the team I worked with there were amazing. Yeah. And it was a really rewarding experience, and I think the exhibition might still be up.
Because of COVID.
Yeah, it was actually, I was back in Australia for an exhibition opening and was going to fly back, and when I got back we were going to have the exhibition opening of Beyond the Binary, and that was end of February, early March last year, which we all now know was the big global kickoff of COVID, and we all went into lockdowns.
Yeah. What was it like when you over in England, and it hit there really hard early, and your flight was cancelled?
I was so lucky. I was stuck in Australia. My flight back was one of the very first leaving Australia, when Australia was kind of the one place in the world to close our borders to, that citizens couldn't leave, and it ended up being the best thing, because even then we had no idea how long this was. I thought, I'll just stay put in Australia for a bit. I had a studio space over in London. We had a house, all of that. So I will go back in 2 or 3 months, pack up, do the rest of the visa, then come back.
So you've still got a place over there?
Well, we ended up packing it up because my visa was coming to an end, and there was no way I was going to get sponsored, and so there was no point. Like, I wasn't physically there, so I had to get it packed up. I had to use a removalist company that would go in and pack everything up for us.
Right.
Yeah, but being stuck in Australia, my partner, on the other hand, she was in London, and Scott Morrison got on the television and said Australians need to come home. And 3 days later, she was on a flight.
Whoa.
Which she's an intensive care nurse, and the thought of being the nurse that we needed in this pandemic in a country where you're not a citizen was just a little bit scary. The NHS has issues, so we were really lucky that she was able to get back as well, and has been nursing in the Melbourne pandemic ever since.
Right. And she came back because she got a job here in Melbourne, so that was the reason you moved to Melbourne.
Yeah.
Are you happy that you've been to a tough time with the pandemic? But has it been enjoyable? Because we're known for our art here in Melbourne.
Yeah, and it's funny, during all of the lockdowns, I've still been happier here in lockdown than I ever was in London when things were fully open. I missed my community greatly, and that was twofold. The arts community in Australia, I find particularly supportive. And then the First Nations community, of course, wasn't as prominent as it is here as it was in London. So I was really homesick and very lonely, but was there with a purpose and wanted to get as much done as I could, and I did, and I will be forever grateful for the time I had there, but really happy that I'm here, and Melbourne just feels like home now.
Great. I'm glad you're here as well. And you are so busy. You're one of the busiest people I know. You know, and this has been through the pandemic, because we're only coming out of it now. You know, like every time I've spoken to you, you know, they've had so much on your plate. You know, so let's start talking about a few of those areas. You've been picked up by Mars Gallery. What does that mean to an artist to have a gallery on site?
It's really funny because I will be the first to admit I'm one of the artists who has no idea what I'm doing, because I didn't do undergrad in fine art. So when Andy from Mars approached me, I had to actually Google what a gallery representation means. And Andy was incredible, and I asked a lot of questions. And kind of now, a year into it, after being, represented, for me, it's having somebody there, not only backing you up, but actively seeking opportunities. And there's an amazing community of artists as well, that we're all represented by one gallery. And I find that that's something really important to me, is getting to know the other artists as well. And I mean, to have the space, the dedicated space to have a show. I've got my first I had a solo there last year on the second level, but I've got my first main room show next year.
So then you got involved in Craft Victoria. What were you doing there? You were involved in an exhibition, curating it?
Yeah, so I got involved with Craft Victoria when I moved to Victoria, because I've been a fan of what they do for so long from afar, living in Queensland. And I became a Maker member, which is Craft Victoria is a membership-based organisation.
Right, yep.
And just through that was asked to contribute works to shows, and I had a vitrine. They've got a little vitrine space, so I did an exhibition there. And then earlier in the year, they asked if I would like to curate an exhibition, not necessarily for NAIDOC, but just during the time that NAIDOC was on. And this year's theme was Heal Country, which I just absolutely loved. And again, after talking about the fires, and so I said yes, and it was my first time curating a show, and I was able to pull together, I think 6 or 7 artists from memory, all who work with kind of the ideas of elements in their work. So I worked with artists who work with fire, water, earth and air to put on an exhibition. And we also had a mural artist, Mirbo, and Alchemy Orange do a floral installation. And so they were all First Nations artists.
Wow.
it was just such an incredibly rewarding,
Yeah.
and it's interesting. I have a brand. I've always respected curators, and I have a whole new respect for curators after curating a show, and it was amazing. I wrote an essay for it, and then as that was kind of winding down, they were also advertising. Their board is made up of industry experts, finance experts, law experts, but really importantly also maker members.
Yep.
And so I applied to be on the board and received that. And it's been an amazing opportunity, one, to just see how an organisation like Craft is governed.
But it's that's a lot of work though, to be on a board, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's been really nice. I've had 2 meetings so far and have been, it's kind of in thinking of a long career on the board and wanting to ease in. So we'll join a few of the subcommittees soon. And myself and Abby Seymour, who's an incredible jeweller, is the other maker member. And it is something, they're an incredibly supportive board in understanding that as much as I'm there to give my expert opinion on what the makers and members want, and I have my own goals in mind for increasing First Nations participation in the space and making sure that First Nations artists and makers know that Craft Victoria is a space that's for them and safe for them.
Yeah.
I'm also there to develop skills, so everybody has been incredible in making sure I'm easing into all of the world of finance spreadsheets and law governance and all of that. And it's an incredible board made up of some really fantastic people.
Oh, I have the highest respect for them. What they do is absolutely amazing. Now, over your shoulder, I can see, are they playing cards? What's going on?
Yeah.
What a smart move.
Thank you. I have been working in artist books. Probably that's been my longest practice. I've only made about 4, but it was one of the first artworks I made was an artist book. And so came across a book earlier in the year called The Lost Boomerang. And it's, I guess in primary school when you're learning to read and you go up the levels and you get marked off. It's one of those books. It's actually an incredibly sweet book about a young boy who, Aboriginal boy who loses his boomerang and his friends help him find it.
Fantastic, I love it.
Yeah, and so every now and then I want to work with a book that's not awful. And so this one was actually quite sweet. While it probably wasn't written by an Aboriginal person and the artwork wasn't done by what struck me though is the title, The Lost Boomerang, and a lot of my work involves interrogating museum collecting and archives, and so the book series is called The Lost Boomerang, and on every single card, so all 52 cards, is a word that you could substitute the word lost. So stolen, collected, acquired, copied, and so kind of looking at not only the ways in which historically our objects were taken, but you look at like the fake art market at the moment, where you've got boomerangs being made and painted overseas and sold to tourists, which is not good for the tourists either, because they think they're getting something authentic. So this book was originally, the first edition used an actual playing card deck that had Aboriginal art on it, and then the second edition I made the box myself and was really interested in. Then on each of the different cards is a different object that's I was able to research on the British Museum online collection. So having that background as a graphic designer, designed 52 cards. Each had a different suite. So there were dilly bags, there were weaponry, there was a boomerang set, and also just wanting to show the diversity of our objects. So the boomerang, the classic shape, but then on these cards, all 50 or all 12, I should say, of that suit have a different boomerang and a different shape. So it was a really rewarding one, and one that I want to keep working on.
Recycled paper?
Yeah, I get the paper made bespoke by a gentleman called Dodgy Paper, who makes. So I collect the book and I tear it, and then I provide him with the torn pieces, which he then makes into professional grade artist paper. I make paper myself at home, but I hand press it, and it's much more sculptural. And for this, I really needed them to feel like cards.
Sure.
And so he does an excellent job, and I'm about to put in another order with him because I've gone through all of, I don't have any more of the Lost Boomerang book, so I'll have to find another book.
Right. And was it popular, the playing cards? Yeah, have you still got many of them?
Yeah, so the first edition was in a show called Pivot, which is an artist book show in Brisbane, and was acquired. And then I made the second edition, which had 3 editions and an artist proof, and all 3 editions have been acquired. One by a gentleman, a curator in Canada, who's researching and doing a show specifically on artists who use playing cards in their practice.
Oh, okay.
So that might be one of my first international acquisitions.
Okay.
Although still in discussions with the Pitt Rivers about the works I've got on show there. So yeah, it was an amazing body of work, and there's quite a lot of interest from people, especially people my age, for the playing cards, and asking if they can buy one. Or so I think one thing I also want to make sure is that I've always got works that are accessible to people.
Yeah.
So working on creating a series of cards that can be more budget friendly, as a part of, because the grass trees and the more sculptural and the dilly bags are not necessarily always for the amateur collector. They do require, they're paper objects, so they need certain conditions.
Yeah, and how much time and effort you put into making it,
yes.
The cost of it goes up
yes.
as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So wanting to make sure that I've got works that, literally friends and family can buy and have, which is something I'll work on later in the year. Yeah.
Jewellery, you make a bit.
Yes.
That's around your neck. And when you came in today, I said, and I knew it was yours because of the red. And you use red a lot. Yes. And I said, well, that's your signature. And it is. And are you moving forward with keeping that as a signature?
Yeah, I am. And it's funny, I used to be petrified of colour. Colour just carries so much meaning, and again, I think having that cross-cultural or mixed race upbringing, colours can have conflicting meanings within my own cultures, and so I was terrified of terrified of colour, because I didn't want it to say anything, when really what I wanted was my materials to say what I wanted it to. But then just one day I realised I needed to use some thread, and I had some red thread lying around, and I think it was one of my cutlery pieces that I did at first, and it just kind of all clicked and made sense that red across almost all of my various cultures is incredibly important and positive. And my mum actually has, she's Anglo-Australian, but she has Scottish ancestry, and even in the family tartan there's that line of red that runs through it.
Of course there is, yeah.
Yeah, and so, of course in Japanese and Chinese, Filipino and Larrakia culture, red is a really important women's colour. And so it just kind of clicked all at once that this one colour could say quite a lot. But again, really positively, and I do think of red as representing blood, but never blood shed. More so around, blood ties and that strength of culture. Yeah. And occasionally I do have to use another colour, particularly in public artwork and projection works, because red is also the colour in a traffic light. And so to have work in the public realm, you have to make sure that it's not going to be interfering with...
okay.
Yeah, so anytime I have a projection on a building, I'm usually using blue, because it's also a beautiful colour, but it means that it's not going to confuse with the traffic light.
But the thing is, it's not paper.
No, yes. These are, every now and then I work with, found objects, colonial style or settler style, silverware or tableware. But this was a project, I made this as a part of Black Design, which is run by the Koori Heritage Trust in partnership with RMIT and the NGV. And it was specifically, there were 11 of us, 11 First Nations artists, and it's a professional development program around jewellery.
Okay.
And around design, and they will do, they're running jewellery again. I think the Expressions of Interest just closed. And over the next, X number of years, they will look at all different disciplines of design.
Yeah.
And so it was an incredible, incredible opportunity, one, to meet artists who live in Victoria as well, but also the skills that we got, being able to work. Yesterday I actually had all the tools out that I had learnt how to use as what I call jewellery school. But I was working with mother of pearl shell, and I just kind of stopped and thought, a year ago I wouldn't have been able to do this because I had no idea what any of the materials were, or the tools, I should say. So I have a Dremel set up at home with all the bits, and I have the mask and the goggles and all the safety gear, which was all given to us as a part of the course. We were given a home setup to kind of help build our jewellery careers. But for me, I've already started using that in other aspects, and I use some of the tools as well when I'm working with paper. And I just think that learning, and especially during all the lockdowns, was just such a positive experience. And it is these works. This is one of a series. This is my test piece. But I've got 6 of them on display currently at the Koori Heritage Trust.
Right. And it's a metal?
Yes, it's recycled sterling silver, and it's made using casting. So I make this out of wax.
Oh, okay.
And the material that's pressed into it is the dilly bag I was given as a baby, and so I was able to press wax onto that and slightly melt it, not so it sticks, but then peel that away and you kind of have the impression.
Oh, wow.
So that was, really, and it was really hard for me to not work with paper because I just am so obsessed with it. But I sat down with Laura and Blanche, who were the 2 contemporary jewellers who were also our teachers, and they said, you know how to work with paper. Why don't you try working with metal, which is why we're here. And so I did, and it was just such a rewarding experience.
But what I love about it is, to hold the cord on it, the little links that go around it. But it reminds me of what you do with, the string. Was that there? Were you thinking that?
Fortunately, Blanche, one of the teachers, sat with me one day, and we looked at the objects I make, and we worked out ways that I could create a complete object in wax that could represent the objects. So, this piece comes back from the caster, and I clean it up, and then I just thread the string through. So instead of sitting there adding rings to an object, it all goes in as one. And comes out as a solid piece of silver. But for me, it was really important that if it was going to be a dilly bag, it needed to have an opening. And so, slowly working on, and I made many little prototypes and eventually worked up to a size that this one is. But
it really, because of the red cord and then the little links, which looks like your paper sewing. It's so you.
Yeah, thank you. And and that was exactly why we went through this incredible year-long process of talking about storytelling through contemporary jewellery. And at the end of the day, what I really, really wanted to make was the type of object I would want to wear. And for me, it's a series of 6. 3 of them have the dilly bag, and the other 3 have the impression of kind of sewing material, because my mum is a home economics teacher. And so I wanted to look at both kind of my matriarchal lines and talk about, cross-cultural teaching and upbringing, and just create an object that I would want to wear. And because of that, I'm just so happy, and people keep asking me if they're available for sale, and I've just decided that no, not this series. I'm going to give them to my family.
Yeah, lovely.
Which I think was such an important. I'm a professional artist now, so it's very rare that I can make things without the plan of having them be income. And so I think it was really important for me to take a step back with this series and think, actually, what's really important about them is that my family are the ones to wear them, because it's about family.
Talking about family, your mum, with her what she does, what does she think of you now? Because she would have think, I helped create this beautiful artist now. She must be so proud of you.
Both of my parents are incredible, and it's kind of, you sit back and reflect on your life, I guess. And my dad taught us so much about our culture, and made sure that we were always really connected. And we moved back to Darwin for a series of years, specifically so we could live on country and get to know our family.
Wow, fantastic.
And then my mum, was, and I say blessed in that she was a stay-at-home mum for most of my kind of upbringing up until I was in high school. So I just had a trained educator at home teaching, and she loved craft, and I was very artistic from an early age and also an early riser. So 5 a.m. she would sit me down at the kitchen table with craft materials so she could go and have a coffee and sit down. And that just seemed to work. And I think a really important part of kind of being an Aboriginal artist is making sure that what you're drawing from is your authentic story. And for me, that made me reflect quite heavily on my upbringing. And, you know, my upbringing is unique, even from, you know, my own cousins or even my own siblings who are potentially the generation younger. So it was a lot of self-reflecting that led me to this practice. And, you know, both my parents are incredibly proud and also will often enter in bidding wars in when my work is up for auction and things, which is incredibly sweet because I will never make my parents pay for my art, but they do, and it's amazing.
Oh, that's so sweet.
It is, and I'm at the moment planning on making them a very little grass tree for a little spot in their home.
Oh.
So it'll be my first time attempting to take something that's my biggest work and turn it into one of my smallest.
Yeah, oh, it's so lovely. There's so many other questions I could ask you and so much that you're doing, and you know, like, but hey, we've got to stop somewhere.
Yes.
But congratulations on such a spectacular career already, and you know, like, and you're so humble with it. You know, like you're so wanting to still venture and learn and be part of organisations, which is really important for an artist like you, I think.
No, thank you very much. And I'm a keen learner. I get very bored if I'm not learning something new. So we'll see in a year's time, maybe I'll come back and we'll see what else I've been up to.
Absolutely, yes, come back. Thank you.
No, thank you.
And thank you for watching. I'm David Hunt and you've been watching The Art Hunter.